Okay, thank you and for introducing me and for having me here. Well, it's always quite humbling to follow Willard in anytime, and he made it even worse by using the word hype at one point. But I'm going to defend myself a little by starting off by quoting him. So just to ennoble myself in some way. Now, I'll be talking on stylometry on ever bigger data, quality and quantity, and the thing I want to say first of all is that at least 3 years ago in his Busa Award lecture, Willard spoke of a certain stalemate in digital humanities as the noble exception. He mentioned our field, computational stylistics. This is for practical purposes a synonym of stylometry. As he said that this is something that should appeal to our traditional humanities colleagues. He seemed to imply we're actually getting some results. Well, this is, perhaps you'll be changing your opinion very quickly as in the next 30 minutes. By the way, I don't know how much time I really have, so 5 minutes before, if I get carried away, start waving frantically at me. Okay, so stylometry is counting stuff in texts, and actually it's whatever works. We count words, we can count commas if we want, we can actually count the times various authors or groups of authors use the word actually, or something like that. And now, it seems that the best results we get for various purposes are when we count the most frequent words, all those modals and function words, but we can also count something else. So now, one of the first uses of that is, of course, authorial attribution, where we count on authors betraying themselves with their favorite words or other favorite uses of those very frequent words. And so, for instance, here, this was done, of course, when the media hype exploded, when Harper Lee, actually her people, published the first version of To Kill a Mockingbird, Go Set a Watchman. Well, that was the thing we did to make sure she really wrote both books. As you know, she did. And actually, it got so hot that the Wall Street Journal wrote about us. Then we discovered that the Wall Street Journal and the publishing house of Go Set a Watchman belonged to the same media empire. So that lessened our satisfaction a little. But still, and then when we started looking into the matter and when the role of the editor became very evident, we wanted to check whether Tae Ho-Hov, that editor who wrote her own book in 1973, whether she had a major hand in the writing of The Mockingbird as the second version of Harper Lee's own Go Set a Watchman. And as you can see here from that bootstrap consensus tree diagram, they're quite far away. The additional, so it looked like the whole thing about how the editor was instrumental in writing that particular book, it seemed completely off until we used another method that cuts up a given text in little pieces and calculates the similarity or the distance between the usage of the most frequent words between some reference texts. And so, just to explain, this is how the story of To Kill a Mockingbird evolves from word 0 to the final word in the book. And the colors denote the greatest bits of the greatest similarity to the authorial fingerprint of Truman Capote, used here mostly as a test, to Harper Lee, Go Set a Watchman, and to Tae Ho-Hov's novel. And now we can see that we do see the impact of the editor, which is very interesting. But what is even more interesting is that this long green, almost completely Harper Lee bit, this is actually the part of To Kill a Mockingbird that was expanded. This is the trial story. Now, the trial is only mentioned in Go Set the Watchman, the first version. And so, but that was the part of the book that the editor, Tehohov, insisted on having expanded. And so we can see that while we see the traces of the editor elsewhere in the book, the story of the trial is pure Harper Lee. And that is a very pleasing thing to notice. Now, there's all kinds of things we can do with those methods, of course, and it's very striking that it's not just the authorial signal that computation stylistic is pretty good at discovering, and sometimes I really wonder how that is possible. Look what happens when someone starts to translate Virginia Woolf's Night and Day into Polish. That was only done a couple of years ago. And it's actually quite a sad story. The first translator translated part of the novel, and then she contracted cancer and died within 3 or 4 months. And then the publishing house hired another translator, also asking her to make sure there is no stylistic rift somewhere in the middle. Well, I guess you can see where the first translator died. That's here. Now the funny thing is, the green translator, Magda Hedel, is a good friend of mine. When I learned what she's doing, I simply asked her to give me the text, not tell me where she took over. And then the next day, I called her and told her, chapter 26, right? And she was speechless. We then wrote a nice paper about it. So now, the moment of truth came when I really saw, in the traditional way, that text. When I realized that, actually I could not believe that the stylometric method could recognize that. The changes in the text were incredibly thorough, and yet the translator's fingerprint was there. Speaking of translations, here's another funny story. As you know, Vladimir Nabokov wrote half of his books in Russian, and the last was Dar, The Gift, written in 1938. And then he switched to English. A very Russian-like English, a very flamboyant English, but English nevertheless. Well, here we have a network diagram of how the books he wrote in Russian compare to his books translated into Russian from the English original, sometimes sometimes much later. And you can see, by the way, that the texts in the original tend to move from early to late. And then we have a rift, and there, of course, all hell breaks loose in terms of color. Actually, throughout this talk, I'll be using this color coding of the ripening aubergine. At least that's why I imagine that. Whatever is green is early, and whatever is purple is late. And we have the yellow and the red in between, so and orange. So now it's also very interesting that the strongest connection here, because obviously the greatest degree of similarity in the usage of most frequent words is in network diagrams is shown by the thickness of the connection and also the closeness of the connection. You can see actually that it's perhaps not surprising, and yet surprising that it's just the function words that tell us that Nabokov's own translation of his English language Lolita is so close to the last thing he wrote in Russian. So there's some sort of magic behind that, or perhaps pure science. I'm not quite sure. Which, speaking of Slavs who write in English, and to move away from the function words a bit, this is another network diagram that shows you the similarities between the usage of parts of speech. In other words, the text has been automatically changed to parts of speech, and we counted, I think, 5 grams, clusters of 5 parts of speech in each text, and compared the similarity here. Of course, in this way, we were trying to somehow get at the syntax of the text. And when we put a bunch of modernist and perhaps postmodernist writers in English, you will see that we have 2 Slavs here, and one is way out there, and that, of course, is Nabokov. And obviously, when you read Nabokov, and especially if you have a working knowledge of Russian, you can see how very literary Russian his English is, and I mean that's why it's so good, I guess. But so he's out there. You can see he's very much in the periphery. But there's another Slav here, this way. There's another Slav here called Joseph Conrad, and he's on the periphery too. Although he is in connection with people like Wells or Galsworthy, and he knew them personally. And also, it's quite perhaps interesting that his early stuff is further out from the center of the network, while his later stuff seems to approach the English syntax of his friends and colleagues and people who helped him in his writing career. Actually, there's right here we have the book you wrote with Ford Maddox Ford. So once again, we see that our pretty little pictures show us things that seem to be making sense from the point of view of traditional literary history or even literary biography. Okay, now speaking of literary, it doesn't have to be pure literature. These are the results we got in a research project I'm running on the Great Awakening in colonial America. Apparently, stylometry also works for Puritan sermons, and we've actually discovered something pretty interesting. Jonathan Edwards asked Whitfield to edit some of his sermons. Here they are. So we're actually getting another idea that while the authorial signal is strong, there are other things that we can see when we count the something very simple. And it doesn't just have to be Puritans. Very non-Puritan French philosophers also have their stylometric tones, whatever you do. So there it is. Now, when we return to real literature, we can actually look at some perhaps reopened old questions, and very often we can confirm those traditional views. This, for instance, is the evolution of Dickens. I hope that is not too cute. And the color coding here is done according to the traditional holy division of Dickens into 4 periods, and you can see that it actually works very beautifully in from what is usually called his experimental phase all the way into his last writings. You can see that it sort of it draws this half an arc, and that it's very evolutionary, very Darwinian. Okay, now from here we can move on into more serious stuff, and this is what happens when you count the most frequent words in 1,000 English novels from Swift to E.L. James. And again, whatever is green is early, etc. And you can see that Well, we get an image which might be evocative of, first of all, linguistic change. I mean, that is obvious. But at the same time, especially when you combine it with the image of Dickens, which who behaves in the same way, and actually Dickens is right here in the middle, and it still works that way. This, by the way, is Henry James. He's very chronological. That's amazing. So, I mean, we're getting a general image, which again makes a lot of sense, but it makes you think that if this is the same phenomenon that we observe within the biography of a given writer, is this just the effect of linguistic change? But of course here, we're coming to a very problematic moment, because somewhere here is where our ability, or the ability of a single researcher to dialogue with this sort of thing, this is where it starts ending. I mean, how many of us in this room have read all those books? How many books can we read? How many books can we sort of intelligently put on a map like that without the use of a computer? Now, this is stated. Oh, and by the way, sorry, this is something I did during the night. So actually, we get very much the same result on the same novels when we do not count, when we don't do the simple thing of counting the most frequent words, when we use some very, very complex maths to create topic models of the words, and we're still getting this chronology thing. So that actually worries me a lot. Now, as I said, we're moving towards an impossibility or at least towards a problem of combining the small human reading with the big computational reading into one meaningful whole. And this is this is stated in I mean, even American sitcoms have something to say about that. Listen to this.
No, I'm serious. You know, for years I have been wishing that I had time to read all of the great books. You know, Dostoevsky and Hemingway, Faulkner, and Dickens, and Shakespeare, and history, U.S. history, world history. They speak language. I mean, why do the humans speak Sumerian anymore? I don't know, because I haven't read the book. Poetry, Byron and Keats and Shelley and biographies. Oh, Julius Caesar and Abraham Lincoln and Groucho Marx. I mean, look at them all. Look at them, they're mocking me. I haven't read any of them. Okay, but just pick one for now. My father, there's not enough time. There's 20 books. There's not enough time. Maybe you just need a system. You know, put a book next to the toilet every couple of days to show you're not going to come chapters. No, it's too late for me. There's not enough bowel movements left.
Exactly, there's not enough bowel movements left. Now, of course, this is stated in a much more elegant way in one of the most exciting books in the recent digital humanities history, Matthew Joker's Microanalysis, where he addresses exactly that and very successfully marries Franco Moretti's distant reading with computational stylistics. And he speaks of the fact how we are finally able to look at this huge body, at a huge body of humanistic data, of literary data in our case, and of course, computers allow us to ask questions, even though they might be slightly different questions, but at least they are questions we can answer. So does this mean that now we have the tools? Well, perhaps we have the tools, but I'm not quite sure we know very well what to do with them. Okay, but on a positive note now, this is something that makes me very excited. Now, you might not know, in a previous lifetime, I've massacred almost 30 English novels into Polish. So I have a proprietary interest in what happens to books when they dragged into another culture and another language. And I've always believed that, that the translator's language is very different, of course, obviously from the original, that is obvious, but also from books by real writers in his or her language. So what we have here is another network diagram of 1,000 Polish novels. These are the white ones. And of course, the white little streaks show connections between those novels. And then the colored ones are translations into Polish from various languages. And you can see that at least some languages, the English in red, the French in green, tend to steer away from the body of Polish literature in the original. That something happens to language, to the Polish language, to the noble Polish language, when it's pushed into the service of another literature. And so it seems that, that this method at least is pretty good at looking at translation needs. And there's something else. You can see that the dark blue stuff here mingles quite freely with the Polish. These are translations from the Russian. And that, of course, makes sense in the sense that these are much more similar languages, that there is much less stress on the transfer from language to language, etc. So obviously, this is a picture I love, and I put it on all my desktops and mobile phones. Now, so we're speaking of 2,000 texts here. But of course we can do more. And what I was hiding from you all the time by looking into the center of this, of whatever this is 10,000 English texts. And the color coding is again, green is 17th century and 20th century is this purplish kind of thing, and white is everything which is more recent than that. So first of all, I don't know what your favorite metaphor is going to be. Mine is usually the Big Bang. It seems like we're having some sort of evolution here, and then something happens right here, and everything explodes. And obviously, it's a very compelling thing. Again, something you can use for decorative purposes. But the problem is, I don't really know what this means. So I'm very gratified I can do this to literary history, but I'm not quite sure I know what I'm doing. So let's see, let's try to put some sense into that. I'm not promising you a lot. So here we have this nice little bit of evolution until something happens right there in the middle. So now, for instance, what I don't understand is what this means for a writer to be here, in the peripheries. Let's see who is in the periphery. So we have Trollope here. I would think he would be so mainstream that he really shouldn't be here. Okay, Henry James has always, in Stylometry, he's always very, very different, so I can somehow live with that. We have the Anne of Green Gables series right there. We have Edith Wharton, a bit closer to the mainstream, whatever that means. We have this, all this is Agatha Christie, that's terrifying. And we have Terry Pratchett, also going south. And we have Enid Blyton, and her neighbor, it seems, is E.L. James, except that they're not really neighbors because there's no connection between them. So it's just an artifact of the method. But I just have no idea what that means. I should be saying things like that. Wrong audience. Okay, now, another little problem that you might have when you're handling 10,000 books is that, especially when you get them the way I got them, and you can torture me any way you want, I'm not going to say how, there are some things you discover only after you've made your diagram. A number of programming handbooks, cookbooks, and these are books on history. Now, the closest literary person to programming cookbooks and history is Tolkien. Okay, and there's John Grisham here. Cormac McCarthy is on the other side of this, and Dean Koontz, and Laura Hamilton, and the Doctor Who novels, irrespective of who wrote them. Duh. You can see I'm trying to stay away from even a suspicion of thinking this might be exceptional literature in some way. I didn't get through with this perception, I hope. Anyway, and what else do we have? Oh, we have Coben and Archer and Danielle Steele. That would suggest really bad literature is on the outskirts, right? I really don't know what to think. Now, speaking of bad literature, there's Stephen King here, but he's in the midst of this white explosion, so that's fine. If you're looking for quality, you have to look into that mesh, and it's very difficult to find your bearings here, but we have the Dubliners somewhere here, and Portrait of the Artist, and then the Ulysses is here, and finally Finnegan's Wake. So, and again, I don't know what that means. And that's sort of a problem, I think. But I love saying that to unprepared people. Okay, now, and still, it is nice to have this, because it sort of tells us, I mean, this is more than a coincidence. It has to mean something, except that we don't really know. And so, I mean, perhaps our problem is we can't visualize or can understand the visualizations as we might probably know. And actually, if you remember your Space Odyssey, we might be at the moment of when the hairy ape finds the bone and starts and takes the first tentative strikes at a carcass lying in front of him, I don't know. So with this in mind, let's see what happens if we try a 3D visualization. That's so cheap. Sorry for that, it was stronger than me. Okay, I don't have any conclusions here because that's where I was leading you, I think. I mean, digital humanities is trying to hijack the term big data. 2 years ago at CERN, we were shown during the post-conference trip there, after the Lausanne DH conference, they showed us a cable and they told us the amount of data that goes through that every second. That's big data. I mean, is 10,000 novels big data? In a way, they of course isn't. But in some ways, perhaps it is. if we define big data as something that is too big for our methods. Perhaps we need a bigger hammer. Perhaps we need a stronger bone. Is big data giving us the big picture? Don't worry, I'm not starting my talk for real right now, actually going towards its ending. Okay, I've already asked that question. And I think I've asked this question. And actually, I have a nice feeling that perhaps it's the problem of the next generation to decide that. And by that I mean you, of course. So I'm leaving you with the mess here. And, but of course, for the digital humanist who's more interested in the humanist, who understands digital as more as an opening of methodological possibilities rather than anything else, the main idea is how to combine those millions of small insights that we have in traditional literary libraries with that big image. In other words, how do we combine distant and close reading? And this is something we stylometrists are very preoccupied with right now. And I think I have nothing else to say. Thank you.
And we still have some time for questions if you have.
This one.
I was just thinking to clarify a bit about coloring, and I was wondering if you could, is that just pure based on the dates of publication?
Yeah, in most cases. Of course, there's all kinds of stuff you might want to do. I mean, if you're familiar with producing network diagrams, you can say in the infamous Gephi, you can use all kinds of modularity to look at that. But of course, the idea here was to look at what happens when we combine the traditional metadata with the results of the statistics. Yes.
Yes, I was also fascinating. Thanks very much. The question about that's fascinating and good in the pictures in the person. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what exactly is looked at in the novels. I didn't quite understand what exactly you're looking at when you have I don't know, Joyce in the middle of the
Well, in this case, this was just we counted the most frequent words. And then we compared long lists of the same most frequent words in all the texts. And then we used some statistical measures of distance, and the most famous among them, the one that was made for literary and linguistic computing, is John Burroughs's delta. And its various versions are still being used and reused. And so we actually look at the delta values, and this tells us the distance or the dissimilarity degree of each particular text. And if we go into and here, for instance, what we see is the way this is done in network analysis is the strength of the connections between each of the texts, and some of them are zero and some of them are very strong, is used to create a gravitational model. In other words, all the data points, which are books, are being gravitationally pushed out. And of course, the strong connections don't allow themselves to be pushed aside very far. And this creates this balance. And this is how this is done.
How can it be that some books or works are completely without connection with the rest of the time they are not writing in the same language? How can it be that
well, they are in the same language. I mean, it only makes sense. Well, it doesn't. I mean, you can use different languages, but the results would be obvious. Except that the methods actually have been hijacked into stylometry from linguistics, and especially from comparing dialects in nearby valleys in New Guinea, I think. But of course, the connections between the particular books. Now, some of them don't have connections at all, but then there are some distant cousins to which they are connected somehow. And this is why this balanced image, this balance of gravity, if you want, is achieved. Yes, please.
Thank you. I just wondered if you tried a similar exercise with punctuation.
Well, people have done it. One of the things is that some stylometrists will treat punctuation as additional features, just to see what happens. Our problem is that, perhaps unintuitively, we still tend to get the best results with just the stupid, most frequent words. And that's very frustrating, because we would really like to give our traditional literary colleagues something more obviously literary. So, but, I mean, you can count anything. There's all kinds of ways in which you can get favorite medium frequency words out of the text, and for instance, look at the favorite words of authors or groups of authors. And that's very fascinating, and that usually, I didn't mention that here, I had to make some choices, but this is something that makes our traditional literary friends much more excited, because then they see that, my student showed me her result yesterday, translations into Polish from Spanish, as opposed to translations from English, tend to speak about God and life and death much more often than the former than the latter. So and that's of course quite exciting. But the statistics I must say, is slightly less strong, because I mean the function. I mean, it's the power of the mass I think that is responsible for this.
Is it something you use to write media text or dialogue?
Oh yeah, I mean in dialogue. First of all, one of the first applications of this was on the dialogue in Jane Austen. That's John Burroughs's book, Computation into Style. Computation into Style. You ripped that book recently, didn't you, Willard? And John Burroughs shows that when Jane Austen writes her characters, similar characters tend to speak in the same way. So Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility would speak very much like, in terms of the usage of most frequent words, as Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice. I'm in a project right now where we're looking at film scripts, and that works well too, except that, for instance, TV series tend to have a stronger signal than the authors, which is an interesting generic thing.
Computation style.
Community style.
Yeah, my original copy of it. These most frequent words, take prepositions, for example. In the finessing of style, when you're writing, the prepositions can be very, very important. And mold meaning is quite significant doing. And the modal words like get, or go, or come, the meaning depends on how the preposition focuses.
Absolutely, and you have played into my hand. Is that the idiom? Because now I now have a pretext to tell my favorite anecdote, and I'll be very quick. And I strongly apologize to everyone who's already heard it more than 10 times. So, previous lifetime, I'm publishing my first translation into Polish. The stupid publisher gave me Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. You don't give a book like that to someone straight out of university. You just don't. But of course, I took it because I knew what it was. I don't think the publisher knew. So it was absolute torture. It took me half a year to translate it. And when I brought in the manuscript, that was still the time of printouts. You wrote printouts to publishers. The editor read it, and after 2 weeks of reading, she called me and said, well, I've corrected all your horrible mistakes of Polish style, and it's almost okay, but there's still something very irritating about your style, and I don't know what it is. And I was very desperate, and at the time I was already starting to count words. I didn't have all this. We're speaking 1994, I think, or 93. So I thought that perhaps just looking at the most frequent words without all this beautiful statistics would help me. So I, as you know, this is the remains of the day is sort of memories of an aging butler. So I took a Polish classic, which also was a first-person account of a shop assistant. Thank God we had something like that. And I look at the most frequent words, and I noticed that in comparison to that classical 19th century Polish writer, an acknowledged master of Polish style, I abused one reflexive pronoun, się. It was like first on my most frequent words list, while it was only fourth on his. So I manipulated the whole text to get rid of phrases with that reflexive pronoun. It took some work, of course. And then I handed in the corrected version, and the editor read it, and she said, well done, what did you do? Of course, I couldn't tell her because she would think, you know, but that's the story. So, I mean, it's things like that that make you believe in counting words. I mean, even stupid words like the most frequent ones.
Hi, thanks as well. I just wanted to try and start to grapple with your sort of questions at the end in terms of intersection of EADH and big data. You used the term hijack to describe how EADH sort of maybe go over the big data banner, but I think you could equally say that big data has hijacked digital humanities, at least historically, in terms of the fact that we speak about big data, even though originally it may be not directly relevant to merge of EADH. I think the answer to your sort of open question is this big data? I think it is, in terms of the humanities we might want to use the term, because I think, at least in practical terms, it represents kind of a step change or a step up in what we're able to do. And it might not be that it breaks our methods, but it at least pivots our understanding out of an abundance of data being available. So not really a question, just a comment on that. And I say this is something who's done an approach to the EADH project with big data. And the title says something I'm kind of sensitive to, but I do think I'm kind of optimistic about how the two terms can be made to work together. That's something you say, not the same thing.
Yeah, the problem that we have is that I mean, in general, digital humanities still has this methodological problem, because at least in my little subfield, we are like dogs who wait for scraps from the table to fall. So we find one, we learn cluster analysis because it was used by someone to look at Papuan languages. And then we learn Gephi and we use that. The problem is perhaps we need something that would be created more for humanities data, and I don't see that happening yet. This is why I think we need our CERN. This is why the opening keynote in Krakow this year will be the professor from Krakow who used to run CERN for the last 3 years. So perhaps she'll tell us how to do that. I mean, how to lie about the need for billions of all kinds of money. So that's the dream.